Okay, Dr. Amjad, I believe you're ready to go. You can call the meeting to order whenever you want.
All right, Jason, thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. We'll just do a quick roll call and make sure we have enough members.
Okay. Dr. Amjad, obviously you're here. Dr. Joggenpally? Do not believe he's here. Colonel Cahill?
Present.
Joe Deegan? No Joe's here. Dr. Khan?
I'm here.
Thank you. Dr. McMillian? I believe he is not here. Mr. Forbes?
I'm present.
Thank you. Dr. Malil, I had communication with him this morning. He's not going to be able to attend. Dr. Barry?
Present.
Mr. Hammers?
Present.
Rusty?
Present.
Dr. Antolini, I know he is on the meeting, but I think he may be having audio problems.
I've got it fixed. I'm present.
All right, sir. Thank you. Dr. Milton?
Present, hopefully accounted for.
Joe Hatton? Joe Hatton?
Present.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Burnaby?
Present.
Okay. All right, Dr. Amjad, we do have a quorum.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So I'll call the meeting to an order, and then we have to go over the previous meeting minutes from March 18th. There are no modifications. Do we have anything to discuss from the last meeting, Jason, or anybody?
Can I make one just edit? Is on page 4, the section up at the top under clarification of recommendation, the first sentence that starts with agreement, the sentence doesn't make much sense. Agreement by members of the board for the need to utilize language to reinforcement messaging to the public that smoking cannabis is prohibited and is not a recommended form of utilization. Would just make a simple change. Agreement by members of the board for the need to utilize language to reinforce messaging as a change.
We will make that change, Dr. Barry. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll move to approve the minutes with that modification from Dr. Barry.
Second.
Okay. If there's nothing else, then we'll go on to the next item.
That would be discussion of the public comments from the last meeting. And also I included the public comment from the work groups.
Does anyone have anything to comment on those?
All right, it sounds like that's a no. Folks, if you could bear with me for just a second, I'm having a bit of trouble with my screen share. Can you all see that PowerPoint?
Yes, Jason, we see it.
Okay, thank you. All right, Dr. Amjad, I'd like to move on to old business. First, I'd like to give an update of the Office of Medical Cannabis progress. So far, we've received 2,150 patient applications. We are taking measures to increase that number. We've started a public information campaign via social media, and also there'll be some print and TV advertisements of the program. We're planning in-person sign-up events. starting here in Charleston, but we'll expand from there. These events will help folks that are having trouble navigating the electronic sign-up process. Also, you may have noticed in the media, we've extended the expiration dates for patient cards for early adopters. So that has helped in increasing those patient application numbers. The next major step that'll be taking place from the office is growers are starting to come online. We anticipate the first grower becoming operational next week. Once we certify them as operational, they can start importing either their seeds or immature cannabis plants for growth and harvest here in West Virginia. Several more growers will come online immediately after that in the month of July and August. Of course, it'll take 3 to 4 months to grow those plants to maturity for harvest. But the program and its permitted facilities are moving forwards. And again, we're seeing that real world progress now versus planning that was taking place beforehand. Any questions about OMC activities? All right, thank you. Next up, we'll move on to our work group updates. Mr. Forbes is the work group chair for policy and program. That work group did meet a couple times since the last full MCAB meeting, and there are a couple proposals to consider. Mr. Forbes, I'll turn this over to you for a report out. I do have Homegrown first.
Sure, thanks, Jason. So the policy and program work group has met twice. In the interim, we met in May, had a really good meeting regarding the Homegrown issue. We had speakers, including Louis Koski from Colorado, and we had Senator Takubo spoke to us about some issues that had come up in the legislature. And so really this issue is one that has been Rusty's sort of been the point person on it. And I think it would make sense for him to make a proposal or share his proposal with the group. But we did hear as to the experiences nationally and Colorado's experience allowing a small amount of Homegrown for individual patients. And there's a serious concern over patient access and cost with respect to not if they can't grow a small amount of plants for personal use for the patients. So with that, Rusty, I don't know if you might want to chime in. I know this has kind of been something that even since our meeting, you've kind of taken the lead on putting something together for the full board on. And then we could also, of course, talk about the next issue that we addressed, which was removing the specific conditions and allowing the physicians to certify based on what they believe as opposed to having the specific condition list. So Rusty, do you want to chime in?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Rusty.
Okay, cool. Yeah, like Mr. Forbes just said, we had a great meeting there with Mr. Koski and Senator Takubo, and at that meeting, we discussed a lot of the potential issues that could come up with Homegrown, mainly regarding security. And I was encouraged that when I started to talk about some of the language that have been shopping around with the legislature for the last couple sessions, mainly the provision that would have included language saying that if a patient is cultivating cannabis plants for their own personal use, if there's anyone in the house under 21 years old, that the plants need to be kept behind lock and key. That could look like a grow box, a grow tent, a closet, a spare bedroom, a greenhouse in your backyard, anything as long as those security measures have been taken into account. And Mr. Koski seemed to be cool with that. He didn't give us his opinion one way or the other. He just kind of talked about some of the experiences that he has seen with Homegrown as a regulator from Colorado. I was encouraged to hear that Senator Takubo said that there was overwhelming support for Homegrown in the Senate, and I think that that's reflected in their actions last legislative session. Senate Bill 231 did a lot of things pertaining to this Medical Cannabis Act. It would have added flower and edibles into the accepted methods of delivery. It expanded the list of conditions, but it also created what they were referring to as compassion certificates to allow patients to grow. And the definition in that particular piece of legislation says a compassion certificate means a temporary certification issued by a practitioner for patients and caregivers to grow, possess, use, or give away cannabis without remuneration for the purpose of obtaining access to medical cannabis as authorized under this article. That bill passed through the Senate with a vote of 29-5 with Homegrown language in it. The provision that Senator Takubo had included in that bill would have allowed patients to grow 12 mature plants and 12 seedlings for personal medical use. And again, it was heavily debated and passed with a vote of 29-5. And when at the work group, when I was asked to put together a proposal, initially, when I started putting this together, I had 7 or 8 pages, that I just kept adding to, and then I realized that I was probably getting a little too far in the weeds as far as specific language for a potential bill. So I tried to scale it back, and basically, there's no need. I feel like there's no need for us to reinvent the wheel here. Right now in this country, we have 36 states that are illegal for medical cannabis, to have established medical cannabis programs. And of those 36 states, 20 of them plus the District of Columbia allow patients to grow. Now I say 20, Virginia is also part of that list. Virginia in their medical program does not allow patients to grow, but they recently passed full legalization, and effective July 1, all Virginia residents over the age of 21 are legally allowed to grow 4 plants. So patients in Virginia can grow, and because of that, I added them to the list. But again, I can't stress enough the need. I know that when we talk about these issues, there's always the discussion of, well, what are they doing in the other states? What are they doing here? Or what are our border states doing? I don't think that can apply here. In West Virginia, we are one of the most economically depressed states in the country, and I think we need to look at this issue through that lens. History shows that upon implementation of medical cannabis programs, it typically takes a few years for the prices in the dispensaries to level out. Business owners are trying to recoup some of those startup costs. With the federal prohibitions and the federal situation, they can't write off anything as far as cost of doing business, and products in dispensaries are expensive. You talk to dispensary owners, and they will tell you that. And I feel like here in West Virginia, we've got nearly 300,000 residents living below the poverty line. We are arguably the most economically depressed state in the country, with some of the worst healthcare outcomes. And I believe that in order to facilitate proper patient access and to make sure that folks aren't being left out of this program, Homegrown is essential. I'm really worried that with how far our dispensaries are spaced out throughout the state, we're going to have folks in rural West Virginia who, whether their barriers are financial or transportation issues or whatever the case may be, they're going to be left out of this program. And I think that if we're truly going to create a cannabis program with the patient as top priority, Homegrown has definitely got to be a part of it. So with that being said, I'm willing to take any questions about Homegrown. I'm not an expert. I've been doing the research on this and looking into this issue for the better part of a decade. But it is something that I feel passionate about, especially after speaking with patients, not just here in West Virginia, but I've gone to Pennsylvania, I've gone to other states and talked to folks experiencing financial difficulties, and the story's the same no matter what state I go to. Folks are still utilizing the black market because dispensary prices are just out of reach for a lot of people. And I have spoken with people who are growing illegally, and I would hate to see us put a West Virginia patient in a position where they could potentially lose their freedom and then through civil asset forfeiture, lose everything they've ever worked for simply because they got caught growing a plant that the state says they're legally allowed to use and the state says that these companies are legally allowed to profit off of. I just think that it's sending the wrong message to patients.
Thanks, Rusty. One other thing I'd just add to that, one of the concerns we had as a work group, or at least a concern I had early on, is since this program really hasn't rolled out yet in West Virginia, should we allow that to happen before we got into a position where we started approving Homegrown? Would it somehow adversely affect the industry, which would affect patient access overall? From what I understood from Mr. Koski's presentation, that really hasn't been the case nationally. What they've seen is there's a limit on plants. It seems that the states vary somewhere between 4 and 12 plants. Maybe 4. I may have that slightly off, but they limit the number of plants that patients or caregivers are allowed to grow at any one time. And that seems to address that. And really, from what I understand, we really haven't heard a lot of industry blowback as to this proposal. And Jason, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's the way I understand it, is that the industry really hasn't spoken up against this in any way. And certainly with the economic conditions that most West Virginia patients are going to have, and the fact that no insurance is going to pay for these products, it seems to make some sense to allow, if this program is going to roll out, and if what we're really focused on is helping patients, which is what this is about. This is not really an industry that was designed as an economic boon to the state. I mean, had that been the case, we'd be on a recreational cannabis board. But in any event, it seems that this really would help patient access from what we've heard and learned. And so I'm happy to field any questions from the rest of the board, or I'm sure Rusty would, and he probably has more information than I do.
And you're correct, Mr. Forbes. I did speak to several of our permittees, including the multi-state operators, and they were really neutral as far as Homegrown goes and its effects on industry.
Yeah,
From a medicinal standpoint, was there any discussion of the working group on quality, consistency, or potency of homegrown products and how that may be assessed periodically, or was that even an issue that was brought up?
That wasn't an issue that was brought up. One of the things that we did discuss was the caregiver portion. I do feel like, and I've spoken to multiple members of the legislature about this concept as well, and it seems they seem to be on the same page with this. But I feel like if a caregiver is growing for multiple patients, then that cannabis should be subject to the same testing protocols that the cannabis found in the dispensaries. We don't want someone growing and potentially, giving someone cannabis that's got mold or pesticides or something like that on it. So that was discussed. But as far as potency of the strains that will be grown, that has not come up in any of the discussions that I've been part of. One of the things that we did talk about briefly, and I've heard from a number of patients in states that do allow patients to cultivate their own cannabis. One of the issues that cause patients to be so outspoken and so for this, there's a lot of you're not guaranteed you're going to find the strain that works for you when you walk into the dispensary, depending on what the growers are cultivating at that time. If for instance, I tried a strain for my neuropathy when I was in Colorado called Trainwreck, and it worked better for my neuropathy than anything I have ever tried in my life. And as a patient, if I had the ability to cultivate, that's the strain that I would grow, right? Just that, because I saw what it did for me. But as far as protocol of testing the potency and all that has not been discussed.
There was some discussion about just generally testing and the cost prohibitive issue of having individuals that are growing this at home having to pay for overall testing. But it was my understanding that, in the event that the legislature would make this change, that the seeds that the patients would get would have to come through an approved dispensary. So, I mean, you'd still have whatever strains are coming are going to be similar in nature to what they could obtain at a dispensary. At least that was the way I understood it. And of course, all we would be doing in the event that the board made a recommendation to the legislature is simply recommending that the legislature examine this issue and potentially remove add into the code that patient home grow or caregiver home grow be allowed up to a certain number of plants.
Yeah, that's kind of why I scaled back the proposal so much to just make it one sheet. I didn't want to go into the weeds and start talking about, I don't think it's the role of this board to dictate the actual policy. I think it's more of our role to basically either stand for or against the general concept. And, should the recommendation pass on to the legislature, it's up to them to figure out the details as far as how to make it work and the regulatory side of things. At least that's my opinion on things.
I have a question, guys. So if we say you recommend home growing for patients or caregivers, there's a recommendation out there that prescribers can recommend X amount of milligrams. I think, Jason, you said in one of the talks that you gave. So how would that factor into that additional recommendation if a patient has a recommendation to get this amount prescribed per month and it can't be refilled within 30 days, and now they're allowed to grow at home? Is there any discrepancy in that, or those are two separate issues if that question is asked?
So, Dr. Amjad, I believe you're referring to the ability of the physician to limit the amount of cannabis products the patient can receive.
Right.
I think that would be a tough one. Certainly it's worth further examination, but I don't know that our regulation of these plants potentially produced through home grow is going to be a strong position. Limiting the amount of product that patient will ultimately receive from those plants would be very tough from our regulatory perspective.
I have another question regarding the security. If these are homegrown anywhere, it would expose to other people who otherwise would not be exposed to any marijuana, and that may cause another social issue. And so is there any security measure? Have you ever discussed about that? How much strong security that person should have around this homegrown marijuana if they have to grow?
Yes, that is something that we've discussed. I've discussed it at length with the legislature over the last, handful of years. And that was one of the reasons that they wanted your plants to be kept behind lock and key, should there be anyone 21 or younger in the house. And also provided that if the person is under 21, that they're not a registered medical cannabis patient. But I would, if this is something that we end up pushing to the legislature, I would urge them to look at the language that Virginia just passed with their full recreational. They're allowing patients and residents there to grow 4 plants, but those plants cannot be in public view. There's some really general language about where they have to be kept and how they have to be cultivated. And I think that if we're mindful, to make sure those provisions are included in this, we can do it safely. I've gone out and I went to Colorado and I went to California, and I've gone out to some legal states to see how this was done there. And again, I think we may be overthinking it. I don't want us to reinvent the wheel on this issue. There are patients that are growing plants in grow boxes. There's people that are growing in little Harbor Freight greenhouses in their backyard, and the security issue with most of these home grow setups is really minimal. The issues, it's come up a few times. People have this notion that we're going to let patients grow and they're going to have fields of cannabis, and medical cannabis is hard to grow. It's not easy for a patient to grow quality medical cannabis. And when you boil it down, even in states that have home grow provisions as part of their bill, most patients don't grow. Most people, when given the option to go to the dispensary and buy products that have already been tested, that are already available, versus spending 4 to 5 months meticulously taking care of this plant in just hoping that you may get something out of it. 9 out of 10 people are going to go to the dispensary. And, I just want us all to be mindful that in West Virginia, I truly feel like the only people that are going to grow cannabis are the people that absolutely have to, or the hobbyists. You're always going to have some folks that just want to do it just to do it. And to that point, I always bring this up because I do think it's an important part of the discussion, but I met with a family in Washington, D.C., and this little girl is 13 years old. She has a neurological disorder that they've not been able to figure out. And they had tried every medication on the market. Nothing worked. The next thing in line was exploratory brain surgery, right? Her mother was not into that idea, took her to Colorado. They spent 6 months trying different products and found that cannabis oil works for her. Well, cannabis oil is extremely expensive. By the gram, you're going to pay upwards of $80 to $100 a gram for something that you could produce in your home if you were allowed to grow your own for pennies on the dollar. So that's what they did. They found out this oil worked. They moved to DC. She cultivates her own cannabis, and this is part of her therapy. The 13-year-old, part of her therapy is tending to those plants and taking care of her medicine, and just the act of cultivating that cannabis from what I was told, has been a huge part of her healing, and a huge part of the therapy regimen that she is now allowing her to live a normal life. So I do think that's part of the conversation that needs to be discussed. This is for a lot of folks. I can speak to my personal situation when I was going through cancer and chemotherapy. It was without question the most hopeful or hopeless situation I'd ever been in my life. No matter, even if you had good days, you come home from the hospital, you still just have it in your head that, oh, wow, I'm dying. And I think that while I was out there tending to the plants in the garden, trying to keep my head right and trying to stay sane through all of that nonsense, I think it would have gone a long way had I been able to, cultivate and tend to plants that were actually making me feel better.
I don't disagree with a lot of stuff you're saying, Rusty, and I think we can use, not reinvent the wheel, like you said, and use a lot of the other states' language and things like that when we make recommendations, but we don't have a lot of forward-thinking people in our state. So we know we have to be prepared to answer certain questions when we make these recommendations to our legislative body. So we need to be prepared to answer even mundane questions such as those. So, we have to be prepared to, answer certain questions. So I don't disagree with everything you just said, but we need to be prepared to at least have some answers for people if they ask us. But, we have to be ready to have something.
Oh, absolutely. And, that's why I think that, that's why I included it as part of that proposal, that I do think that, if we're going to allow patients to grow, we've got to do it right. And it should be, they should be growing their plants behind lock and key, that we should be taking measures to keep it safe. But again, to the point of not having too many forward-thinking people in the mix here, I do think it's important to note that our state Senate, very conservative state Senate, passed a home grow provision that would have allowed patients to grow 24 plants, 12 mature, 12 premature. The issue of security came up. They debated this issue both in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate and on the floor. And it passed overwhelmingly. So I do think that this is something that we can make happen. And again, with the recommendation from this board, I think that, I don't know that we need to get into the weeds on the actual creation of policy. It's more of we stand with this concept kind of thing,
From a just conceptual idea too. I mean, I think one thing it's really important to focus on is the first part of what Rusty said, that the idea here would be to try to help curb a potential increase in the black market. I mean, what we really don't want to see happen is this program roll out and poor cancer patients in West Virginia can't afford the product, so they start buying it from drug dealers. Then you're getting a street drug, God knows what's in it, what they're getting. You've got an increase in crime and a bad element coming in to fill a void there that maybe can sell the stuff cheaper that isn't regulated. And so that, I mean, I think part of this, the idea is for folks that just simply can't afford to deal with the dispensary, it's another avenue and another option. I mean, it seems that the business end of this is really not taking the position because they probably realize that most people aren't going to go through the process of trying to grow this stuff at home and the length and the things that Rusty's discussed. So, I mean, I think that's one thing, if we looked at doing something here, I agree with the idea that it would need to be a general recommendation that the legislature examine this and that the legislature consider specific things to put in to allow for home grow with these protections. The other option we could do, obviously, is, and we went through this before, is consider continual discussion of this through our board as the program rolls out, and maybe make a recommendation at a later time. I mean, obviously, we've got some time before the next legislative session, so we're not in a position where we've got to immediately run with a recommendation here. If the rest of the board feels we need more details on this, certainly our work group is happy to do the work and have more meetings and try to put together some more specific proposals if that's something that people want. But I think it is important just to kind of focus on the idea that we really don't want patients running out and buying this stuff off the street.
And one other thing to the point of security, I know that it's probably not security in the typical way that you would think about it, but with the provision that they included in the Senate Bill 231, it wouldn't be just you're a patient, you're certified to use medical cannabis in this state so you can grow. No, you would have to apply, and you'd have to be issued what they were referring to as a compassion certificate. So when you're issued that certificate, you'd be on a registry. The Office of Medical Cannabis and DHHR would know who is growing. So we already have laws against illegally selling cannabis. Those protections are already in place. So if somebody would try to do something nefarious, those protections are already in place. But I do think that compassion certificate would go a long way just as far as the regulatory side of things. So at least we would know who's growing, and if a problem would arise, then we could deal with it pretty easily.
Rusty, do we have examples from Mr. Koski or the other states where they've actually done that? Because it's my understanding that in states where they have allowed home grow, there's actually been an increase in the illegal market. And I know in Colorado, anyway, there's been this proliferation of cartels that have come in and have just grown a lot of cannabis, basically bad actors, not patients who are just trying to make money, of course, on the black market. And so you've had a proliferation of this because there really hasn't been a good mechanism or way to have any teeth in examining and scrutinizing, et cetera. Did anybody talk about that, or do we have any data regarding that issue?
Yes, Mr. Koski did talk about that, and you're right. When Colorado initially allowed people to grow, they did have problems with people. Basically, what caregivers were doing was signing up five, 6 patients, and starting warehouse grows, essentially, because they didn't have a limit on the plants. When it first started out, there was no limit on the plants, and then they backed it down to 99 plants per patient, which was still incredibly too much, and those problems still were there. They have since rolled it back to now patients in Colorado and anybody over 21 years old in Colorado can grow 6 plants. You can grow 6 mature and 6 premature, and that has pretty much ended those issues. But yeah, you're right. When they first did this and they didn't have a plant count, it was pretty much the Wild West. It was unregulated, and caregivers were growing excessive amounts of cannabis and putting it out into the mix. That's certainly not what we want to see happen here in West Virginia. There definitely needs to be a plant count. I was actually surprised to see the Senate pass 231 with 24 plants in the mix. When we had initially started that conversation and when we were pushing our proposal there, we had called for 6 mature plants and 12 seedlings, which is it's right in line with what Colorado and a lot of the other states are doing. There are states that allow patients to grow 12 mature plants, but we thought just for the sake of trying to get this proposal through the more conservative legislature to reducing that amount would probably be more beneficial as far as getting this actually done. But the Senate, again, they debated this issue and they went with 24. So I do think that as long as there is a plant cap and we're not letting folks come in here and do what they did in Colorado, we should be all right. When it comes to caregivers, I personally, and this is not language that I have seen in any bill yet, but I think that caregivers should also be limited to the amount of patients they can grow for. If we're going to let someone be a caregiver, I personally don't think they should be growing for more than 3 patients, 5 patients at the most. But yes, that was discussed. Mr. Koski, he was concerned with the way things started in Colorado, but he said that once they got their hands on the reins and figured things out a little bit more, that those problems have been taken care of. At least that's how I remember our conversation. Jesse, if you've got any input on that.
No, I think that's right. I think you summarized it essentially as he did.
It seems to make sense to me that limiting the number of plants could limit those types of problems that you mentioned, but I'm still kind of wondering is how is that actually assessed and regulated? And I wonder if we have any data from these other states to actually demonstrate, have we seen an increase in the illegal market? And does it shift based on the number of plants, for instance? Do we have anything hard that we could really hang our hats on to make an educated decision regarding this?
Not specifically that I've seen, but I would be more than happy to to try to get that information. Again, it's with each state doing things differently. There's no 2 states that have done this exactly the same. So that data may be a little difficult to find a baseline, but I'm certainly willing to go and see what I can find out. I do think it's important to mention that when we talk about illegal markets and all of that, all of the cannabis sold right now in West Virginia is through an illegal market. All of the cannabis that has been available and that patients have been using in West Virginia for generations. I spoke with a gentleman there last year that has been using cannabis illegally to treat his ailments for 40 years. And every bit of it has been black market illegal cannabis. So that industry is already here. And I think that, it just makes sense if we are truly serious about combating that, regulation is the way to go. And I think that, permitting patients the ability to cultivate their own, like Jesse said, he touched on it earlier, that's going to keep those patients from utilizing the black market. So, that's just kind of where I'm at on it. But again, I'm more than happy to go and try to find that information out for you.
Jason, I don't know how much time we've got overall. I know we've got to address the other recommendation we have. Does the board, just generally talking about this, we have some time, obviously, before the next legislative session. Is this something that collectively we feel like we should go ahead and try to tackle today, or perhaps we should reschedule the talk about cultivation for the next full board meeting and maybe have some answers to, or at least look into some answers to some of the questions that have been raised today?
Jesse, I have a question. Jan Cahill here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
And I just kind of learned this a few minutes before logging on. Once issued, this is for Jesse or Rusty, once issued a compassion certificate, what are the provisions in there to keep folks honest on that with the lock and key aspect and a 24 plant threshold? Is there a release they sign for the DHHR inspectors to come in or law enforcement, or how I know that's going to be a question that'll be asked of us.
There's nothing in the draft that that says anything about inspections or whatever. I can read the language as it was drafted in 231. It says, the Bureau shall create a registry of all applicable patients and caregivers granted a compassion certificate by a practitioner pursuant to the provisions of this section. A compassion certificate authorizes a patient or caregiver to lawfully grow no more than 12 mature flowering cannabis plants and up to 12 cannabis seedlings at one time, provided that a caregiver has authorized 12 mature and 12 seedlings per patient. A compassion certificate authorizes each patient to possess no more than 4 ounces of dry flower or leaf medical cannabis per patient. Provided, however, that compassion certificates and the authority authorized thereby become void upon the Bureau declaring that there is sufficient medical cannabis to meet demand through other means authorized by this article. That is the full text that was in the bill. So there was nothing in there about inspections coming to check out and keep people on the level. But I'm sure that again, that to me sounds like a question that the legislature would have to to work out. Should this recommendation be adopted and pushed through the legislature when they're actually creating this provision? That is something that I definitely think needs to be addressed, but that would be up to the legislature to do, in my opinion.
Well, and then you get into a cost issue of, is DHHR going to do routine inspections of every patient that's signed up to grow? Or, I mean, how does that get handled? I suppose one way from a police perspective, and Colonel, you know more about it than the rest of us, but if these folks are on a registry that they're actively growing, and if there was some kind of concern that they were doing something more than just growing for their own patient use or the caregiver for the patient's use, you could go through the normal drug units and police work to try to identify that and even potentially end up in a situation where you have to get a search warrant to go in and if you think the person's selling it or transferring it or has more than they're supposed to. But yeah, I mean, I think we look at the Senate bill because that's, we heard from Dr. Takubo, and that's, I mean, there certainly is an appetite in the Senate, but this is something that has been done by nearly 20 other states at this point. And, a lot of these folks, I mean, one way or another, this is going to roll out and you're going to have patients being able to use this product next year. So, I mean, by the end of the year, but I mean, by next year, you're going to have a really active industry with this. And so it's really just a question at this point of how we craft this access. Do we allow these people that can't afford it to try to figure out a way to grow it for themselves? It sounds like with the questions that we're having, it may make sense to table the cultivation issue until the next meeting and try to identify a few other questions. I mean, from my perspective, I'm happy to move forward with making a recommendation, but I think that it sounds like there's a lot of questions from other board members, and we certainly at this point have some time before the next legislative session. So it might make sense to make sure this is ironed out so that we have a really specific recommendation with respect to cultivation that we could put before this board. And if the board's comfortable with it, then making that recommendation to the legislature.
Yeah, this is Joe. I was thinking that, with what Jan was saying, I think that question is going to come up about enforcement or monitoring or some mechanism to assure safety. I think we're going to have to do some research on that, like what other states are doing in that regard, because I believe in West Virginia that with our legislature, that's probably going to be a question that is raised. How are we going to assure that this is done properly?
So Jesse and Rusty, we are past 50% of our time now. It seems like Mr. Forbes is leaning towards sending this back to his work group. Perhaps Dr. Amjad, you may want to ask for a motion to take that action at this time if everyone's agreeable to
that. Yes, Jason. So is there a motion to, I guess, move this to the next meeting that we'll have and then take it back to the work group?
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Okay. Thank you.
all in favor of that motion?
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Okay. Moving on to Rusty's next recommendation.
Can I say something on that one first quickly? And because I know we're running low on time. The next recommendation has to do with removing the specific conditions and allowing the registered physicians that are registered through the Office of Medical Cannabis to certify patients with serious medical conditions who they believe in their judgment could benefit from the use of medical cannabis. Essentially, this would open it up to allowing the doctors to make a decision as to what they believe is best for their patient and not arbitrarily be controlled by a list of 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 conditions or whatever it might be. Essentially, we would just be giving the judgment to the medical doctors who are certified here. This was something we took up in the work group. The department supported us, is my understanding that the department is behind this. This is something that, from my estimation, just makes sense. I mean, these are doctors that, and we've got a number of doctors on this board, but my view is that if you can perform brain surgery and prescribe opiates, you ought to be able to make a judgment call for your patient about whether or not medical cannabis is something that they could benefit from. Obviously, you're not going to be prescribing it. So the recommendation essentially would be to send this to the legislature, recommending from the board that we leave this in the discretion of the doctors and let the treating physicians actually make the call here, not limiting this to certain specific conditions. So with that, Rusty, I don't know if you have something to add. I just kind of wanted to streamline it because I know we're running out of time.
No, you nailed it. I know I can be long-winded, so I appreciate the brief summary. That was spot on.
Does anyone have any questions? Jason, do you want to chime in on that? I mean, I'm representing that the department was in agreement with us at the work group meeting, but I think it might be helpful for the board to hear that.
Sure, Jesse. We did have discussions regarding this topic with Dr. Amjad, and the Bureau overall feels that it is reasonable to allow physicians to use their medical judgment whether or not a patient should qualify for medical cannabis versus the current specific list of diagnoses.
Does anyone have any questions? I mean, essentially, this is just saying, let's not over-regulate what a doctor does with their patient.
I don't have any. I would like to just point out, though, that this particular recommendation is supported by industry, it's supported by patients, it's supported by the medical community and the Office of Medical Cannabis. So just thought it's important to know that everybody, all the stakeholders are in support.
What medical community is in support of this?
Every single doctor that I have personally spoken with, the doctors that are serving in the state legislature, Senate Bill 231 that also would have addressed this list of conditions was introduced by Senate Majority Leader Dr. Tom Takubo and co-sponsored by Drs. Maroney and Dr. Stallings. I realize that there are probably folks in the medical community that don't agree with medical cannabis at all, and I do acknowledge that, but the overwhelming majority of physicians that I have spoken to think this list needs to go away.
So I guess, yeah, that makes me think about this, good back and forth with it. Certainly I wanted to have doctors be able to offer their opinions unfettered as much as possible. At the same time, I think it's really important that we do have some guardrails, and noting that, you know, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and almost every major American medical associations do not support these conditions to be treated by cannabis. And if we're going to go on this road, somewhere that we have not been before in this state, and watching kind of what's happening with other states, I really think we need to take the tact of go low and go slow. And let's not make the same mistake we did with opioids, where it became very wide open, Wild West, and doctors were prescribing it for any number of conditions that had no scientific basis for it, and we came into a big problem that we're still trying to wrestle with. So I would be very much against going forward with this.
I just want to say, if a doctor that is certifying someone for medical cannabis acts in a way that makes a certification where they don't actually have an opinion medically that the person can benefit from them, then they shouldn't be doing that. I mean, here, this is a situation where what worries me is we're going to have some, and I'm obviously not a doctor, but we're going to have something where a person doesn't fit directly into the specific diagnosis that's in this list. And that physician, who again, could cut them open and perform heart surgery, can't say, yeah, I want to certify them for medical cannabis because I think there's a medically beneficial reason to do that. I mean, I just have real trouble with getting between patients and the doctor and the government essentially over-regulating what a physician can and cannot do in their judgment. I mean, these are folks that are licensed, they're professionals, they've been to school. I mean, the doctors on this board know this a lot better than me, but I would trust the doctor to make the decision more so than an arbitrary list that's passed by the legislature. So from my position, I think this one's a no-brainer.
The problem is that physicians need guidelines from medical legal standpoints. And although I wouldn't say that these are the greatest guidelines, they did serve as at least some way of justifying the use of medicinal cannabis. Typically in a lot of states, there is this other rider that says, or any other condition that a physician deems appropriate. I don't believe that's on this list. And as Dr. Berry noted, there's not a lot of evidence to support any of these on the list, but they've been approved via certain experts. So I think the idea that we have no guidelines is problematic. To lock somebody into one of these, whatever number there are here, is probably unrealistic also, but I think we need to be somewhere in between.
Well, and we talked about that a little bit at the work group about whether we should just make a recommendation that the legislature increase the risk, or we get back to this idea that we just leave it in the doctor's discretion. One way maybe to handle that would be to leave the conditions in the list with that catch-all that, if there's another or other serious medical conditions that, a certified physician believes the patient may benefit from the use of medical cannabis. I mean, we add something like that as a catch-all provision at the end, I think would achieve the same thing, but also leave some sense of guidelines there as to what conditions are at least there is data to approve. And it would also open it so that if there's new studies that physicians see that there's some other condition or disease that maybe could benefit from this, they don't have to wait to go, through a multi-year process with the legislature to help their patient.
That would be my recommendation.
I'm fine with modifying it to add that at the end, as opposed to just removing all the conditions. I don't know what Jason or Rusty, what you guys want to chime in on. I know you all sort of worked on the language on this. So if there's something a different thought, let us know.
So after recent legal counsel, I just need to clarify that this recommendation would solely be from the board. I can certainly chime in on technicalities, but you can recommend anything that the board feels reasonable based on your proposals and votes. But there needs to be a clear separation there. The advisory board is separate from the Bureau and OMC.
Sure.
So this is Joe Hatton. A couple of years ago, we went through a process of developing a form that doctors and patients could go and ask for other ailments to be added to the list for medical cannabis. Whatever happened to that information then?
Yeah, Joe, that form is active. That's actually the next topic to discuss. There have been some difficulties with convening the work group that those suggestions are routed to. But that form is active, and we are receiving those suggestions from the public and also healthcare providers.
Are we getting an overwhelming response from the public of additional ailments, or are we just getting a few?
I wouldn't say it's overwhelming. We may have half a dozen currently.
Thank you.
This is a sidebar, but I do want to make this comment. I know our physicians are being trained before they become, before they're able to make the recommendation. I just wonder, are they being trained about cannabis use disorder, the DSM-5, that there are people that do develop problems and addictions with cannabis. And, that I would feel safer knowing the training that we're providing to our physicians does include cannabis use disorder, signs and symptoms, and, being sure that, and I don't know, maybe that's been presented to the board before, exactly what that training looks like, but I would just want to make sure that, because we really did not have that kind of training for opioid use disorder for physicians until now, that opioid prescribing becomes part and parcel of their training. I just think that our physicians definitely need to understand that there are people who develop a marijuana use disorder. And, I, for one, am one, and I'm in recovery with that. And I'm not really opposed on this particular topic. I just really believe that our physicians need to understand that there are folks who do develop signs and symptoms of disorder, and that potential is there.
So that is part of the 4-hour training required for physicians, Joe, but I do want to emphasize that is only 4 hours of training, and it's only meant as a supplement to the physicians, of course, much larger general training as a physician.
To answer some of those questions, though, Joe, I think moving forward, those are things we can discuss with the Board of Medicine. It's ongoing CME training or continuing medical education. I know even with the opioid disorder, those are things that we implemented at moving forward because of the problems we've had. I know even speaking now, we talk about HIV training, other training now that we want to implement with providers, not just with my generation and older generation, but with the younger medical school trainings that are coming in so that they're better prepared. So these are things that we should have providers doing, not just to get certified so they can start prescribing, but to be up to date with things like exactly what you're talking about, because we're so busy working all the time that we don't have time to update ourselves with educational things. So these are things we can discuss with the Board of Medicine to get them, not just that it's required, but things that we should, maybe if we have to enforce it in our daily curricula stuff to get certified again for our licensing exams and things. But we can surely do those things for providers in the state moving forward.
Yeah, along those lines too, somebody's been through medical school, and actually somebody who's training medical students and residents for the last 15 years and know what the status is across the country regarding medical education. There is a really unfortunate paucity in the amount of training regarding addiction and psychiatric disorders in general among a lot of our colleagues, unfortunately. And again, getting back to the whole opioid crisis, that was part of the problem. And I would appeal to us that we really, let's just start slow and see what we can learn as we go forward, as we learn more about what are the conditions that really could be beneficial with some of these products and what are the potential risks. And I think we need to keep that at the forefront of our priorities is first do no harm. And as we learn, as we get more education, then we could possibly open it up further, but we'll have evidence to actually support doing that. And I know in Colorado, because of the devastating effect for a number of families with the increased access to cannabis, is a bill was passed by their legislators almost unanimously to have a year where an independent body is actually able to look at the evidence and to support what can be done safely and what shouldn't be done safely, and what recommendations are appropriate and which direction to go. And that report should be done in a year. Let's wait a little while so we get more information. Then we could open up things as needed. It's going to be a lot harder to close it up and tighten it after things have been open.
I get what you're saying, but I feel like if we go any slower than we've been going, this program's not going to exist. I've spoken with folks in the industry that are permit holders that are looking at the patient registry numbers, and they want out. This is by opening up the program. Not only are we going to facilitate better patient access, but it's going to actually get this program running again. I mean, it's been moving at a snail's pace. This legislation was signed into law on April 19th, 2019. And here we are in 2021, still trying to get it implemented. Patients are still without access. I've spoken with folks that are dead. They died before they had access to legal medical cannabis. They were using illegally. So I'm glad that they were able to, at least some of these people were able to get some relief. But I just think that, if we go any slower, this program, we won't have a medical cannabis program. Recreational will happen nationally before we get the first medical cannabis dispensary door open if we push any harder on the brakes. Again, California has been doing this since 1996. Colorado now has been working, they're almost a decade into a completely legal market. These horror stories and these scenarios that keep getting presented in West Virginia, that, oh, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? We've looked to other states, they've been doing it for decades, and these problems have not come up on the level that, folks say they are. And I do think it's a little disturbing that here in West Virginia, we're totally fine. I mean, we've got one of the biggest addiction epidemics in the entire country. Opioids, they've flooded this entire state with opioids. And now we have an opportunity to give people a safer, natural alternative. To me, and this medical cannabis program is a tool of harm reduction. And I just think that it's hypocritical to tell folks that we need to push the brakes on a medical cannabis program while we have doctors who are openly putting Suboxone out on the streets. I worked in the tattoo industry. Cats come in the tattoo shop and try to use Suboxone as currency. So I just think a lot of the fear that's surrounding the medical cannabis industry or the medical cannabis issue altogether in West Virginia is just unfounded. I think that this recommendation, again, is not only going to facilitate better patient access. We got folks struggling with things like, I met a girl with gastroparesis. Cannabis is the only thing that helps her out. If she doesn't have cannabis, she can't eat. Well, she got caught with a little bit of cannabis, so now she's a criminal. She's a criminal for trying to use something, for using a flower, a plant that has given her relief for decades. Now she's a criminal because she got caught. Gastroparesis is not on the list. Even if this program is up and running, we're going to have people suffering through ailments that are going to continue to be treated like criminals. And I just think that putting the brakes on this program is absolutely the wrong way to go about it.
I hear you. I would say that if the intent of medical cannabis is to increase access, then certainly this recommendation would do that. But I would say that we have a greater responsibility to not only increase access, but to make sure that the public is safe and that any harms are mitigated from increased access. And so if that's the case, if we are truly going to call it medicine, if we're going to truly make it a medical condition, I mean, otherwise we could just make it recreational and let anybody take it because it can help them in whatever other way, or because they want to take it recreationally. But we're calling this medicine, and we need to be able to then justify why we're calling it medicine and have the same safeguards of any other medicine. to be able to do that. And so having actually a list of conditions that at least have some evidence, and then look at, okay, what are the doses? What are the frequency? What are the time frames that you can use to use a product the way you would any other medication?
I believe the question on the table is, do we remove these conditions, or do we keep these conditions with the modifier of other serious medical conditions deemed by the prescribing or certified physician? And be my recommendation that we add that as the top starts. These are certified patients with serious medical conditions. These are just some examples of those. And maybe we add the modifier that was proposed earlier.
Yeah, I'd second that we change this to a recommendation to the legislature that would leave the conditions in the list, but then adding at the end another condition under the list of conditions, or any other serious medical condition for which the physician believes the patient may benefit from the use of medical cannabis. I mean, I think that would address it, and that would leave guidelines in place for the doctors, but also acknowledge that we're going to trust doctors that can prescribe all sorts of medications to make some kind of judgment if they actually have a patient that has a condition that they really want to help, such as the types that Rusty's talked about. Then the doctor can make that call. I trust the doctors to do that. So I second that recommendation. I think that's what we've got now before the board.
So, Dr. Amjad, it sounds like we have a motion and a second there. Do you want to take a vote on this?
Yes, Jason, we can take a vote. So do we just have one thing to vote on then, with the keeping the list and then adding the amendment, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So I have a feeling this is not going to be unanimous. So let's do this slower than usual. Let's hear all those.
Read the motion before you get started, so we know what we're talking about, please.
Yeah, Jesse.
Yeah. So the motion would be to, and you can see it on the screen here, to leave the serious medical condition list as is, and then after, I believe it's Q is the, or no, I'm sorry, that's an O, I think. O is terminally ill. After that, it would be to add another letter that would say, or any other serious medical condition for which the physician believes the patient may benefit from the use of medical cannabis. I think that would address it. Again, this would be a recommendation. We don't change law. This is just to get the discussion to the legislature. And I think all of the things that Dr. Berry has mentioned and the other physicians and other members of the board have mentioned are things the legislature needs to really look at. I think from our perspective, our role is supposed to be to make recommendations to the legislature so they look at these things. We can't change the law. DHHR can't change the law. But the legislatures need to look at, do they want to leave a list in place that's concrete with these conditions, or do they want to start the discussion and formulate specific language in the law that allows a physician to treat their patient without having to wait for a legislative change?
Well, my question is though, all that doctors can do right now is certify that you have one of these conditions on the list, correct?
Correct.
With that caveat added at the bottom, what are they certifying? If there's no condition on the list, what are they certifying?
I think,
but the way I understand it though, that caveat will allow them to make a recommendation, which changes the way the industry works in West Virginia. It'll go from certifying that you have one of these conditions to a recommendation. I don't understand. And plus, I don't understand what the need to I guess just for the theater of all of it, that those conditions serve as a guideline. But if this would pass with that caveat and it would allow physicians to recommend medical cannabis for any serious condition they think could benefit, I don't understand why that list needs to be there. Am I looking at this wrong? But I'm seeing the difference between certification of conditions to recommendation
Rusty, I don't think this would be a recommendation. I think what they'd be doing is certifying that the patient has another serious medical condition for which they could benefit from medical cannabis, but not arbitrarily defining that condition. So that if there's another disease or problem that a patient is facing, it gives another tool in the toolkit to the doctor to try to help them. But I don't think this would be a change where they would now be recommending or prescribing medical cannabis. I think all this would be doing is saying they are certifying that the patient has a serious medical condition. It's not one of the things from A through O, but it's another serious medical condition from which they could benefit from the use of cannabis. That's the way.
In the example that you gave, and I don't necessarily like to use anecdotal in support of diagnosis or treatment, but gastroparesis in this particular case would be then acceptable, in my opinion, based upon the added language.
I think that's right. That's the way I understand it from the legal effect. If we would add this language, or again, all we would be doing is recommending to the legislature to add this language, and these discussions would then take place there, which is the benefit of this. I mean, our role was supposed to be to try to make recommendations that we think help with patient access and to allow this program to roll out effectively and safely. So I think that by doing this, the legislature would have to then consider whether they really want to take this step, and all of the things and concerns that have been voiced can be voiced there. But I think hopefully that clears up what it is that's pending right now for a vote.
All right. Is there any more discussion before we move to the vote?
One quick question, and if somebody on the board knows this, is there a limit on the number of patients that a provider can certify for?
There is not.
So one of the problems that I know in other states that have had, where it's been opened up to a number of other conditions like what we are discussing, is you have a small number of providers who then are writing a large number of certification. That becomes part and parcel of what they do, and it becomes much more of a economic issue as opposed to really a health issue. And so that is one of my concerns that I have of opening it up to any condition.
Any follow-up discussion? Okay. Is everyone comfortable in the fact they know what they're voting on at this point? Okay. I'm going to take that as a yes. Dr. Amjad, yay or nay?
Yay.
Colonel Cahill?
Yay.
Joe?
Nay.
Which one?
Joe Deegan, what was that again?
No.
Okay. Dr. Khan? Dr. Khan, yay or nay? Let's see, he may have dropped off. Yeah, he's going. We still have a quorum, so we're still good to go. Dr. McMillian, yay or nay? Dr. McMillian? Okay, looks like he's not here. Mr. Forbes?
I vote yes. Yay.
Okay. Dr. Barry?
Nay?
Mr. Hammers?
Oh, yes.
Dr. Antolini?
Yay.
Dr. Milton?
Yay.
All right, Joe number 2, Joe Hatton.
Nay.
And Mr. Burnaby.
Nay.
All right, folks, give me a second. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 nays. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 yays. So the motion does pass.
I didn't vote.
I'm sorry, who are we missing?
Rusty,
Rusty.
Oh, Rusty, sorry about that. Rusty, what's your vote?
I vote yay.
All right, 7 yays, 4 nays. All right, so that motion does pass. Any other discussion of this topic before we move on? Okay. Next up, I don't have a slide for this, but we need to discuss the health and medical work group. Dr. Berry, you're chair of this work group. We've had difficulties in convening the work group. Physician participation has been a challenge. We continue to work on that. I was able to make some recent progress with one of the members via different means of communication, but there are only 4 members. So when we have difficulties in participation at all, it makes it very difficult to move forwards with that. Dr. Berry, if you want to speak to that, you're more than welcome. But at this point, Dr. Amjad, I would suggest asking for volunteers to join that work group. Certainly, I think it'd be helpful if they had a medical background, but Dr. Berry, maybe you have further thoughts.
Yeah, you summed it up well, Jason. It's just been a challenge getting people to be able to schedule. So I think it's wise to open it up, and especially for people who have some medical background, it would be helpful in health.
This is Dr. Antolini. If you can go ahead and put me on the email list for that work group, I'll volunteer my time on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other volunteers for that work group?
If Milton's not on it, send me the stuff.
Okay, thank you. All right, Dr. Berry, I know you put a lot of effort and thought into those recommendations that you made, so I will do my best to get that work group convened with the new members as soon as possible.
Thank you, Jason.
Jason, I have a question about the motion that just passed. During our work group discussion, Senator Takubo was talking about he said that the support was so much that this is something that could potentially happen. This recommendation could potentially happen during special session before the legislature meets for regular session in January. I'm just wondering if maybe we shouldn't think about moving to request that Governor Justice add this recommendation to the call of special session, simply because after talking with folks in the industry, again, I touched on it there earlier, but there's a lot of people who are concerned with the low amount of patients that have registered so far. This may, if we could get this done in special session, it may increase those numbers pretty quickly. I was just wondering if
So Rusty, I don't feel like I can speak to that. However, I can tell you that the Bureau and OMC will move to forward the board's recommendations as soon as possible. However, if the board wants to take that action and make that request, you're more than welcome to. Again, it's the board's prerogative.
Rusty, I hear what you're saying. I guess one thought I would have is, there's a lot of moving parts in a special session. And I think if we get the recommendation to the governor and to the legislature as quickly as possible, then really that's something it seems to me from this board's perspective, I'm not sure that for this that we ought to be taking a position on when the governor calls for a special session or not. I think that we definitely need to get this there as quick as possible, but I'm not sure that having the board vote to make some recommendation about the legislature coming in with the expense and everything else that happens with that is something that we necessarily ought to be doing at this point.
No, no. Well, I wasn't talking about, requesting that he call a special session specifically for this. I was just, I know they'll be meeting again in September. I was just saying that maybe we could move to request that he add this to the call of that special session, not, call them in specifically to deal with this, but try to get this done before dispensary doors are open. I'm worried about the dispensary doors being open, period. Yeah.
Any further discussion on that?
What if we just recommended that the Office of Medical Cannabis, as promptly as possible, get this, get our recommendation to the governor and the legislature? Again, I just don't know that we need to be in a position where we're asking the governor to put things on the special session agenda. I don't have a problem necessarily with, I agree with you that this needs to move as quick as possible, and that we definitely need to find a way to make sure this industry rolls out, because it's been a long journey of it. But I just have some concern about us taking positions as to when the legislature, or when the governor calls the legislature in to do what. I think our role is more to make recommendations generally with respect to policy.
And Mr. Forbes, again, I'll assure you that we'll move it as fast as possible from our end. Rusty, is this, are you satisfied with that, or is your previous comment something you want to pursue?
Yeah, I'm satisfied with that. I do agree that, it is not the role of this board to try to dictate policy or whatever, but I just really feel, I think that it is our role to do everything we possibly can to see to it that this program is implemented correctly, and that we're doing everything we can to facilitate the best patient access. I do think that, again, if it's not an action that this board wants to take at the moment, then I'm very relentless. I'll be bugging our lawmakers regardless to try to get this added to the call of special session. But I just, in my head, I thought that it may be a strong showing if the Medical Cannabis Advisory Board put out a statement saying, not only did we make this recommendation, but we feel that it should be implemented sooner than later. But if the board doesn't want to move on that issue today, I'm okay with that.
All right. Based on that, I'm going to assume that we can move forwards if I don't hear any objections. Okay. All right, folks, we need to, I'm sorry, before we move on to this, we're doing something a little bit different this time around. Last meeting, the board requested the opportunity to take live public comment during this meeting. We have been doing that with the work group meetings that previously occurred. We set up a similar structure this time around. However, there was much less response this time than during the previous work group meetings, which was surprising. I don't believe we have any public logged in to Zoom via their computer. However, there are a couple callers. I'm unsure who those folks are. I'm assuming they're public who may want to comment. So if the board is open to it, I would open the floor up to those folks at this point for public comment. Dr. Amjad, are you good with that?
Yes, thanks, Jason.
And folks, those callers even appear to have dropped off at this point. I'm scrolling down through the list and they don't appear to be on the meeting any longer. So it looks like we do not have any live public commenters, but rest assured, we did implement that process in the same way that we have for the previous work group meetings. Again, just not a whole lot of participation this time. Maybe it's because this is during the day and when the work groups were in the evening. I'm not sure. Okay. Moving on. Are there any action items besides moving the serious medical condition change forward to the legislature and Homegrown back to the work group? Okay. Next up, we need to set a date for the next meeting. And also before that, we need to decide what format this meeting is going to be in moving forwards. Does the board wish to stay virtual, or do you want to move towards an in-person format?
My vote would be to stay virtual. It would be much harder to participate having to travel. And I would suspect that at least for a number of the positions, that would be the case too.
Would it be possible to do something that's kind of joint? I mean, allow a virtual option, but also do something in person? I know, Jason, I want to commend you and the office for making sure the public can comment at these things. We've had some good public participation in the work group meetings we had, but I know that it's just a little bit challenging to get the public involvement in this virtual format. And previous to this, we seem to have a lot more public sentiment and public participation. And I think for those of us that are vaccinated, being able to participate in person, it might help with that. But maybe we could also have a virtual option. I mean, even for myself, there's times when I'm going to be traveling for work or something else where I just can't participate in person. And I know for the physicians that's difficult, but maybe there's a way to do a hybrid where there's a virtual option, but yet we have an in-person meeting as well.
I would second that, Jason. Maybe we get some big meeting room and then do what Jesse just said, so that the people who live far away and can't travel, we can Zoom them in and then have a place for people to sit for the public, and then whoever can join live or something.
We can certainly make that happen. It will take some coordination well in advance. One concern I would have, however, is possibly the folks that do join virtually may not quite have the same level of input the folks would that are there in person. But if the board wants to try that combination format, we can certainly attempt to make that happen.
I believe the common verbiage is hybrid, and I support that.
So do I.
Okay. Is there anyone that does not want to try a hybrid format moving forward? Okay, that's what we'll do. Next up are the dates. We did push this meeting back a week. We can either move back to our standard date of 9/16, or we can keep 9/23 based on the members' availability. Anyone have any preferences?
I would prefer 9/23. I have a trial that prior to the 16th week, and I'm not going to be available. So the 23rd will be better on my end.
Okay. Anyone else? Anybody not good with the 23rd? Okay. How about time? We added 30 minutes to this meeting to allow for that live public comment, which we ended up using it anyway, just based on the discussion between the members. Do you all want to keep noon to 1:30? Anyone not want noon to 1:30? Okay. So the 23rd, noon to 1:30 hybrid format. Does anyone want to add any topics for discussion to the next board meeting?
Yeah, I would like to add a potential recommendation to enter into reciprocity agreements with our bordering states.
So Rusty, just from a technical perspective, reciprocity is addressed in the act. That would, again, similar to the other recommendations, take legislative action. I just want to clarify that for the board members.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And then we're going to take cultivation back to the work group, but after that, I would expect we'd need to have it on the agenda in September for the full board again.
Yep. Rusty, as far as reciprocity, for the sake of expediency, I feel like maybe we should go ahead and route that to the work group for initial discussion also. Would you be okay with that versus just throwing it on the next full meeting agenda?
Yes, sir. That'd be fine.
Okay, we'll put that on your work group also. Any other topics anyone wishes to discuss at the next meeting?
Joe wrote in the chat that he wants a grower update. I don't know if you saw that, Jason.
I didn't, but we will certainly include that. I'm a little limited on my end due to the screen share as far as what I can see.
Yeah, I think it'd be good just to know how the folks that are growing, how they're proceeding, and when product might be ready to go to processing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we might even be able to share a few photos from the progress inside the grows at that point.
Do you have a number on providers, like physicians?
I don't have the exact number, Mr. Deegan, but I believe we're about 55 at this point.
There isn't a big interest in providers, the ones at least that I've talked to. A lot of them are fearful of different things because of the unknown. So at least the ones that I've spoken to personally, there's not a lot of interest in it yet because of legal issues and so on. So there's not a lot of interest yet. We haven't seen a lot of them applying. We went to a talk in Raleigh County, even with medical providers, and they're not, they're wary of things yet. So.
And we're going to continue to pursue that topic. I've talked to our education provider within the past couple of days, and they're willing to help out on that front also. So we'll keep trying to add to that provider number. Okay. So again, we didn't have any live public comment. I just want to make the public aware that may watch this meeting later on or may be watching right now. You can submit a written comment to our MedCan email box that's on the screen right now. Please make sure you put MCAB public comment in the title line of those written comments. There's a lot of different emails that come into that box, so it is very important that you do put that in the title line. Please submit that comment by July 15th. All right, Dr. Amjad, that's all I have. Unless you have anything else or any other members, I'm going to suggest closing the meeting at this time.
I don't, Jason. Thank you for everything. And we'll just need a motion to close the meeting, guys.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Thanks. Thank you. Have a good rest of the afternoon.